the better we know a thing, the less conscious we are of it. Part of my problem with the way a lot of clinical psychology is practiced is this perpetual look inward and backward to some fantasy of being like the pristine child. It's like, well, at a certain point, your inner child maybe just has to grow up. And part of the means of that is, I think, the development of skillful action.
Hey guys, before we get to this week's episode, I wanted to let you know about an exciting development at Evolve Move Play. So we are bringing back our 2-day traveling workshops. So that means one of our workshops might be coming out to a city near you, or potentially you could reach out to us and bring us to a city near you. We did this for years. When I started Evolve Move Play, I taught traveling workshops all over the world from 2013 to 2019. But after the birth of my youngest daughter, I needed to stay home more with my wife and my 3 kids. And so we stopped those. But now we have a really amazing staff of teachers who've come up with me through the retreats of the last few years. And I myself have a little bit more freedom to travel. So we've got 4 upcoming dates here in the States and 2 dates in Europe coming up where you can come and train with us for just 2 days. That means it's going to be a lot easier entry point as far as cost and logistics for you to come and join us. So check out what's going on with our 2-day workshops in the link down below. And we look forward to seeing you in a city near you soon.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve Move Play podcast. Today my guests are Dave Wardman from Physical Alchemy and Chandler Stevens from Ecosomatics. So both these guys have been on the channel before. Hopefully you guys are familiar with them. And this conversation came out in particular because Dave asked me to read a book called The Reenchantment of the World many years ago. I finished it recently, though my reading of it was kind of split up by several months, so I'm not sure how good my comprehension is. But I was talking to Chandler about it, and he was saying that it's one of his favorite books as well. And I thought it'd be a fun thing to sort of review the concepts of it and talk about how those concepts are interacting with each of our works and, you know, what we can kind of learn from them and trying to approach the problems that we're trying to solve. Sound good, guys?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let me start with you, Dave. Why did you want me to read this book?
It's a very interesting book. It's
just because it's an interesting book, or is there anything in particular that you want?
No, it's specifically interesting. It's unlike a lot of books. It's a very good book. Very different. And its first interesting point is you hardly ever find it in normal bookstores here, which I think is quite an oversight given what is on the bookshelves in Australia, at least. Particularly pertinent because I think it was written in the year I was born even, and it's talking quite clearly about stuff that's arising now. Also for me personally, at a juncture of my craft development, I think you would call it, sometime around 2009, maybe slightly later, I read it and it profoundly changed what I wanted to do with physical training that I was kind of collecting and collating, and had a vague idea I wanted to do something different. But this book was a kind of, and the next one were very important for different reasons in orientating where I looked. And of course, then it stepped on from lots of places there, but it's a very good kind of introduction to a junction that shifted my work away from a lot of the other things I was doing. So, plus there's lots of funny stuff in it. The Reichian analysis of Sir Isaac is worth the price of admission alone. The funny stuff. Some other very interesting insights in there. Right now, in terms of my work, I'm actually going back and kind of doing a triangular dissection of it, which is interesting, but I won't be able to publish that until later this year.
Okay.
So yeah, it's been helpful at a lot of stages, and thanks to Mr. Berman for doing it, really.
It's interesting you said that it's maybe not well known enough. I, in preparation for this, I read an essay in the LA Review of Books about the problem with reenchantment.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like since 2000 or something, there have been like 8 books that have been published with the same title, The Reenchantment of the World. It's a hot topic, but that book or that review doesn't mention Berman's book at all, and it sort of talks about Max Weber, obviously, as sort of the beginning of this discussion, right? I can't remember the German for the unmagicking of the world, but that's been translated into English as the disenchantment of the world. And that term was something that Weber was talking about. So it was kind of interesting just to see how ubiquitous the topic is, and then that this book, which precedes these other books that share the same title by many, many years, wasn't really considered. Chandler, how did you come across Morris Berman's book, and kind of what was its impact on you and your work?
I think the trail that led me to Berman was Gregory Bateson. Took a deep dive into Steps to an Ecology of Mind many years ago, and that influenced my reading of Berman quite a bit. I think that's how I got there, and then where I clicked with it most was, as Dave was saying, some of the Reichian work throughout it as well. In terms of how it factors into things at this point, man, I think it just does such a good job encapsulating the fundamental schizoid problem that we're dealing with culturally, societally. I'm sure we'll get into a lot more of that as we continue, but more recently I've been doing research into some of Lang's work that Berman mentions in there as well. And I think, given the things that the three of us are up to, I imagine we take a look at it from different sides, but long story short, that's what got me into it. It was originally through Bateson, figuring out where the Bateson Riverhead fed, and Berman was obviously one of them.
Interesting. Yeah, so it was an interesting book for me to read because I really enjoyed the aspects on the history of science, right? And how science was wrapped up in alchemy, and the whole question of the alchemical imagination is very fascinating. And then it starts to get into a lot of concepts that I find very resonant with what John Vervaeke is doing around, how we recover the lost ways of knowing, of participation and perspectival knowing, and even procedural knowing. The word participation is a big one, obviously, in Berman, but that the way that it's used is slightly different. But the central idea that we see over and over again, that somehow through the Cartesian legacy, through the Personal Reformation, there was a kind of loss of the sense of the human being as continuous, and the human consciousness as continuous with the rest of the world, even as continuous with the body in some sense, and that's not actually scientifically well grounded, but that it's still kind of the paradigm from which we're operating, and that if we can't get out of that paradigm, that we have a problem. That was what I really resonated with. I found some of the proposed solutions felt very 1970s to me, and also there's in exploring these spaces, I often find that there's a retreat, a potential retreat from good scientific epistemology. There's a passage in the book where he says we have to treat it as factual that alchemists achieved the transmutation of lead into gold. And I don't think we have to do that. I think that's a very strange claim. And I think it gets at attention that is very important, though, which is that there is something that's broken there, and that as we try to step through it, it's not exactly clear what's on the other side. And so there's a lot of opportunity for confusion. And I think that's what we saw a lot in the 1960s. So yeah, that was my take on it so far. I was just looking through it this morning, and I felt like I really need to reread it to have a better understanding of what he's saying, and kind of just sit with some of the passages and think, okay, what is he trying to say here, right? How does this reflect these other areas of research that I'm doing? But let's start here. I mean, if either of you guys want to pick up something I said, that's fine. But how do you conceptualize the idea of disenchantment, right? If the world needs to be re-enchanted, we are in a place of disenchantment. What does that mean? And if, one of the things that's coming around a lot in the kind of circles that I'm communicating in is the sense that, like, whether we will it or no, the disenchantment is sort of dissipating. Like, the tides of modernity are ebbing, is something like Paul van der Kloot would say. And the religious is popping up in all sorts of places that when we thought we had sort of gotten rid of it. So what is your understanding of the disenchantment that we are trying to re-enchant from?
I have a very different take on that word than most people.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the book itself captures the kind of movement from the medieval period to the early modern and on quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people I've talked to tend to emphasize that as being the disenchantment, as in that particular junction. Whereas for me, it was simply moving from one form of disenchantment, one epoch into the next, and there was one preceding that. So for me, disenchantment has been there for many thousands of years. It's talked about in ancient Greece in different ways, but not in the normal channels. It's talked about in the plays, like the frogs, for instance. And you can watch these currents, of which there are 3 strains, weaving throughout history, but they appear differently in each epoch. So, for instance, when Berman talks about the Chinese creating gunpowder, but they made fireworks out of it, but no ammunition, that was besides being a different culture, of course, it was also a different epoch of Earth. And so different things were possible. Same with the navigation of globe and all these perceptual instruments shifting that Berman captures actually extremely well. I don't localize them around the scientific era. I localize them through the whole of history. And so for me, in essence, to look at history is to look at disenchantment and reenchantment weaving each other, but in different strands.
Mm. How about for you, Chandler?
I'm trying to think through how to say this. I don't want to reduce it to this, but I think, at least the way I conceptualize disenchantment, it's quite closely related to the sort of pervasive neuroticizing influence of society. And I think it's very closely linked to a blunting in our affective experience. So I would tend to look at it as a fundamental, call it like an ontological or an epistemological split within the self and within the way that the self relates to the surroundings. And I think that the neurotic situation is very tightly linked to affective experience, and that they don't offer us a total means back into something like reenchantment, but man, I think they're a key piece of the puzzle.
Sorry, the embodiment piece you say is how we get back into enchantment.
I think it's fundamental to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, Dave, when you're talking about this isn't sort of just, the post-Cartesian problem. That reminds me of, I think Vervaeke's model offers a little bit longer history of this disenchantment, right? Because he really starts with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, and the development of shamanism as psychotechnology. But he tracks really the meaning crisis to the beginning of the meaning crisis as at the Axial Revolution, and the move from a continuous cosmos where man and the supernatural are viewed as sort of continuous with each other, right? We're not separated from the animistic realm, to a world in which we have this 2 worlds mythology, right? So in some ways, you might think of the parable of the cave as a story of is related to the disenchantment reenchantment idea, right? There's an illusion that we're living within, and this is an attempt to think about how we can move past that illusion, right? It's what Plato is talking about is in some ways not so different maybe than what Buddha is talking about in the sense of awakening. There's another layer of reality to which we have access, but which our cultural habits have somehow hardened us away from accessing. And within Vervaeke's model, the 2 worlds mythology, it helps us, and during the Axial Revolution, deal with strains that had come out of the growth of societies that were very different than things that had preceded them. But it, in some strange way, it sort of separates the self, right? It begins the mind-body separation, right? The spirit is separate from the body. And there is this higher realm, the realm of the forms, the realm of spirit, the realm of heaven. So Dave, do you see disenchantment and reenchantment as being fundamentally problems that have always existed with human beings, or is it something that does kind of arise at some epoch of human history, but far preceding the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution?
I can't really comment on the late Paleolithic or anything like that, and so I wasn't there.
Axial age.
Don't think I was there.
Okay.
So I've been watching Viveki's stuff, and I disagree with a lot of what he says, as well as Berman. So I'm doing an analysis on both of them together. They both have interesting things along the way. I think one of the things that happens, the mind-body split can be traced to lots of different places, and it has kind of a different aspect. But this whole kind of idea of there being one realm, whereas if you look at in a lot of the traditions that work with this type of stuff, there's lots of different veils. It's not just a type of thing. There's the ordinary realm, which I call the realm of the square, which I would classify as disenchantment. But getting out of that doesn't mean that one has attained liberation. There's all these other gradations along the way moving forward. So it's a spectrum more than just a one-time thing. We like the one-time, yes, no, black, white type of things rather than the spectrum. And so it's difficult to talk about because anyone who has a perceptual shift goes, oh, it's this one. Well, not anyone, but there's a strong kind of correlation that when someone has a major breakthrough, they assume it's the same as some other major breakthrough. And they don't understand that there can be any number of these and they can happen bodily. Like I had heaps of them in the early phase, just learning that, oh my God, like just sensory motor amnesia level. Like I can't feel half my body, maybe not even, that's a very generous type of figure there. Like 90% of it. Isn't that weird? Like, why can't I feel my own body? But that's pretty base level. And there's much more shocking kind of perceptual shifts ahead. So there's a kind of a lot of what I'm trying to do is there's no way to argue about something if two people can't see the same thing. And that's what perceptual realm break is about. We can't have a Socratic dialogue about this or a discussion or even an argument if you can't see what I'm talking about. So a lot of what I've been doing is a triangular analysis on, like we talked about last time, showing what it isn't, showing what patterns happen when people don't make it, what happens when people mutate on their way out of this. So even within the realm of the square, which I correlate with being the disenchantment, which is not it's like a blip along the whole spectrum of what is possible. There are a number of stages in that have their own perceptual realm breaks, that have their own mutations possible and recoagulations possible. And those are actually mappable. So that's what I'm doing.
Viveki's been talking about the idea that the Socratic dialogues are not primarily propositional, right? They're actually more similar to like the parables of Christ, which are also should be seen as really very much like Zen koans, right? All of these things are designed not so much to just give you a set of propositions to operate off of, but to try to provoke you to be able to have that lens shift. So that seems like what you're pointing to as well, Dave, is a sense of how do we, like you said, you can't necessarily have a good dialogue or discussion when you have a fundamental difference of what you're seeing, right? So I was just reading the section where he talks about the perception of color, right? So we have the Newtonian sort of description of how the wavelengths correlate to color in a very specific laboratory environment. But when you step outside of that laboratory environment, you can elicit the perception of different colors by very different wavelengths in the individual observer. So there isn't a one-to-one correlation between the wavelength and the perception. Now, I'm sure you guys have all seen the dress, right? That's blue.
Yeah,
gold,
just thinking
right?
of that.
Now, there's no way to have a discussion about that just looking at it, right? Like you perceive it one way and I perceive it another, and there's just, tell someone gives you another picture of the dress and you can say, okay, and this picture of the dress is actually blue, and every other picture the dress is actually blue. It's just within this lighting that we couldn't see it that way. But until you have that information, you're just stuck seeing different facts, right? So there's a kind of fundamental incongruence that can't be solved through simple propositional dialogue. And then the only way to solve it in some sense is to be able to trigger the shift in perspective that allows the shared perspective. Now, does that all make sense to you, Dave? Is that kind of hitting along the lines that you're trying to map?
It does. But then for me, you can do a meta map on those. So when people mention those kind of 9-dot problem, blue dress, other perceptual experiments, and then if you see that they mention like Wittgenstein or Merleau-Ponty or these things, you start to get a cluster of how that person thinks. So you know that they couldn't be actually seeing some of the things I'm talking about, because you would stop talking about those things as examples of perceptual shifts of this order. They are perceptual shifts for sure. Mm-hmm. Just as is getting back and feeling your hip flexors or jumping from a tree and dealing with adrenaline is, but they're of an order which is in the middle bracket of removal of the square for me. So you can see by people's bringing up of certain examples or authors, the words they use, lots of other signs, and correlating them, trying them together, that they can see that that's a thing, and no, the things you talk about in terms of we can't discuss the fact and value type of thing, but I can see a cluster that has a meaning that people bring up those ones as examples. I never bring those ones up. I know what they are. I used to be fascinated by them, but they don't fascinate me anymore, but they are a property of the real world as well. Mm-hmm. So I can show evidence of absence by the evidence that the person brings up.
Sure, that makes sense. Chandler, how does what's being generated in your head as this dialogue is happening?
Oh, empty space. I find myself drifting some, but maybe that's part of it too. What comes up for me in relation to what you were mentioning before, though, is that, as practitioners, as facilitators, whatever the case may be, we do actually have the means to create this we can create conditions for learning where a person might actually then become aware of, I think, Dave, what maybe you're suggesting, some of these gaps in their perception, gaps in their action. There's, I think, a necessity for us to be pretty clear as practitioners with, I found myself wondering, what constitutes liberation? Since you said that earlier, Dave, I was just like, yeah, man, you're right. You can break out of one of these little traps of thinking, perception. But then toward what are we aiming? Is there a kind of positive ideal, or do we just continue to buffer against these negative selections? Not that, that's not quite it. Not that, that's not quite it. I find myself wondering, what do we think constitutes this liberatory praxis?
It's funny because this is what I grilled Dave on in our last conversation. Was talk a lot about letting go of things, and if it's done correctly, it has a good result. But the whole concept of correct implies a clear endpoint, right? So you can't just simply remove constraints and open degrees of freedom, and have a defined endpoint without having a good that's defined in some sense a priori. Mm. And this is the problem. And so I think this is, let's ground that. I think that may be difficult for somebody who's just tuning into this conversation. but I think this is like really what happened in the 60s, right? And this is why I react to Berman or some of these other thinkers, Reich, because we had the sense that the culture was overly constrained, that the paradigms that were available to us were insufficient for solving the types of problems that we faced. And there was this sense that the correct response was simply the opening up of the degrees of freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a child of the counterculture, what I experienced and saw was that a lot of really negative behavior sort of rides in on that opening up of constraints. What I see in a lot of these thinkers is particularly an interest in opening constraints around sexuality. And what I saw in the counterculture was a lot of abusive sexuality, a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of just leaky sexuality, uncareful sexuality, abuse of children. And so I'm always like, why are these guys so freaking horny and disgusting? Anytime somebody is like citing Marcuse positively, I'm like, oh. So that's where, I think that like I get really hung up on, you have to have a better a priori concept of the good before you just start tearing down the structures.
Mm-hmm.
So why are these guys so horny, Dave? And is there a better way to do it?
Well, the society is definitely repressing of the creative life energies, including sexual, but it's so repressed, and the kind of coding that we have, it always does a massive pendulum. We don't do a gradual type of shift thing. There's a very bottled up thing. Like Jung's essay on Wotan about what happened in Germany is explicit of that as well. You suppress enough, like it turns into hypercolored fucking clusterfuck, or it turns into genocide. It turns one way or the other, but then the society itself is fucked too. So what do we do is a very interesting question, but I think you can actually slowly dissolve and digest these things without going completely polarized in any one direction. Again, the pendulum is kind of binary anyway. You swing from one end to the other. Don't go completely out of it.
You often hear this idea of the pendulum, right? Like, oh, we have to swing the other way. It's too far this way, so we have to swing the other way. But the problem with that is that it's just imagine that there's sort of a pathological expression of either side of whatever binary you want to do. And if you push the pendulum such that you spend more time in the pathology, right? Just like you swing wider over here, you're going to swing wider on the other side. And if, healthy is somewhere here, then pushing the pendulum on either side is going to mean we're going to spend less time in that kind of middle pathway. Like, let's think about like the flow channel with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, right? So, you can be in apathy or anxiety, right? On two extremes. So the flow channel, like you scale up ability and have an enjoyable experience when you relatively tightly stay in the middle of that pendulum. You're going to have some spikes of anxiety. You're going to be under challenged and go into apathy, but you don't want to spend, you don't want the thing to get wider and wider. And the sense that I have in our culture is in a lot of ways, it's seeming to actually, we're not tuning in better to a positive central groove. We're getting more deranged in the extremes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as we're processing this, like the question has to be, how do we, recoagulate in your sort of terminology, Dave, more effectively as we go through those stages, so that we're not simply breaking the thing, but we are always reintegrating. Does that make sense?
I would agree. Like things are going like this. But for me, it's like if you look at like easy examples like politics, left and right, for me, centrists are the worst of the bunch in a lot of ways. Can't be either of them. The fact of the matter is they're for me, I don't think I could probably count on my hand alone the people who've actually picked their politics, in my opinion, by how I look at the disenchantment. So I would not classify as any of those. I don't seek to classify myself. My politics is reenchantment. And it's a realm break. So it's not left, right, or center. It's like when you look at all the stuff happening in metamodernism and in embodiment, people are trying to centricize things, and it's one of the best possible places to see disenchantment in its mutated form.
Can you explain a little bit more about that?
No, I cannot. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave this because it needs all the deciphering tools to drop into the pond.
Okay, cool.
I think there's something significant, though, in the divestment from categorization. I find that, at least the way I would conceptualize some of it, part of the problem of disenchantment, I don't know how it fits into the realms idea necessarily, but there's this fetishizing of categories, like the need to define myself as this or that, liberal, vegan, CrossFitter, whatever the hell the case may be. And it brings to mind, I'll just circle back to some of the Bateson stuff. He describes these logical categories of learning and communication. And they're not perfect models, but I think that they get the conversation going some. One of them, he talks about learning to, which is essentially like the character we develop, the kind of persona we portray, the kind of adjectival description you might give of a person. And that's bodied forth in a way as well. It's in their motor habit, we might say.
Yeah, let's back up just for a second. So you said learning to, which sounds like learning TO, but learning one, learning two, the number, and learning three.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just really briefly kind of run through that.
Okay, so really briefly, you'd have zero learning, which is a failure to change between time one and time two. It stays the same. Mm-hmm. Learning one would be there is a change between time one and time two, a change of behavior, let's say. So you get some of the basic ideas around conditioning would apply there. Mm-hmm. Learning two, he unhelpfully describes as a change of change. Mm-hmm. Most people then just their heads start to swim. I like the way he frames that in terms of this is learning about context. You're learning about the sort of person you are, the sort of world that you inhabit. That would be learning two, where we get to the character stuff. Learning three, then, very unhelpfully, is the change of change. But it's like, all right, you learn how to ramp up your acclimation to contexts. You maybe learn how to divest from having your sense of security contingent upon a particular character. And what I find really interesting about his description of learning three is that he says this is, it's not without risk. People can psychoticize quite easily. They can, however, stabilize themselves through some of the concrete details. Like if you're hungry, you eat. If you're tired, you sleep. Maybe if you're horny, you fuck. Who knows? But you don't have this kind of hemming and hawing socialization of your bodily experience. And then the really interesting thing, in my opinion, about it is he also links this learning three to something like what William Blake describes in The Auguries of Innocence, where you have this fascination, this wonder at just any goddamn thing you encounter. You can immerse yourself in the relationship with that phenomenon. I bring that up because I think it is important that you mentioned before, we can't just strip away all of this. And it's close to home for me because I had a period where I psychoticized for a little while in an attempt to peel away shit without really having any kind of stabilizing ideal with it. I take refuge then in some ways in the ability to concretely situate oneself moment to moment in embodied experience again. And that I think it's something Bateson hit on a bit. It's something that Berman extends. Neither one of them, I think, really establishes a good practice for that, which is, well, maybe that's where we come in.
Yeah. Well, that just reminds me of the frustration that I have in that kind of the whole sphere of sense making, I guess, or whatever you want to call this sphere, the wisdom sphere, which is just a sense that there's so much capacity, there's so much bandwidth for the exchange of propositions that it's very, it's just very easy for that to become prioritized and to miss that it's really fundamentally crippled as a means, right? It's like we somehow need to get back the gymnasia, right? We gotta wrestle and dance and fight and race and, maybe do acid. And like, I'm not a guy who does acid, but like the Eleusinian Mysteries, that was basically a psychedelic, and all of that stuff was sort of that was all grounds that have kind of been forgotten for the cultivation of philosophy, not as a academic discipline, but as a pursuit of self-transformation in the hope of attaining wisdom. And so it still feels like that it's always somewhat of an afterthought in the conversation. It's like, yeah, the body, but then no, I told Chandler about this, but I don't know, maybe this is an interesting thing, but I had this dream where I was hanging out with Jordan Peterson and his wife, and we were watching a documentary about Jordan Peterson. Mm-hmm. And so then afterwards we were hanging out in my kitchen, and I was talking to him about his work, and he was really bored. He was very disconnected, and you could feel that there was this like desire to connect, but it was like, I'm just about done. I'm gonna have to leave soon. And then I asked him about if he'd been aware of the work that I'd done with John, and then he became very interested, and we sat down and had this really intense chat. And I had just finished the book, Berman's book, the night before I had this dream, and so then I started talking to him about concepts from the book. In particular, we were talking about the Reichian idea that the subconscious is the body, right? And that in the recognition of the self, we have to continually root back to what is the full thing, that we're so often operating from this very isolated conception of the self. But like looking into Reich, he's a very uncomfortable figure for me to read about, right? Because there's something really profound there, but there's also like, a lot that reminds me of the aspects of the counterculture that I think have been profoundly unhealthy for us as a culture. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of, that was on my mind, but you brought up that idea repeatedly, that there's something critical about rooting back to felt experience. And, then we could bring up like David Abram, The Spell of the Sensuous, like that we've been, in some sense, divorcing ourselves from the primacy of the sensed world, right? This is also Berman's point around, I think it's Land's work on color, right? And Goethe's critique of Newton, right? There's a, and this is again, Dave, you said you really enjoyed my conversation with Jonathan Pageau. That was this big part of Pageau's idea too. It's like, if we invest ourselves in a paradigm that is necessarily contingent upon our sensed experience of the world, but that doesn't actually try to respect and understand that felt experience, it's going to create incoherence, right? It's going to create a broken solution, right? So how do we reenchant the body and its relationship to the world?
One of the things that comes to mind there related to I think Berman says it. I don't know that Reich directly says it, but I think Berman, attempting to talk about Reich, basically says the body is the unconscious. Mm-hmm. I always get a little skeptical whenever I hear the preceding the word unconscious, I think it's so easily reified, but I do think it sets the stage for a psychology-based and skillful action.
Mm-hmm.
And part of my problem with the way a lot of clinical psychology is practiced is this perpetual look inward and backward to some fantasy of being like, the pristine child. It's like, well, at a certain point, your inner child maybe just has to grow up. And part of the means of that is, I think, the development of skillful action, knowing that the better we know a thing, the less conscious we are of it. And that's where, I think, Rafe, the work you do just really excels with that. It's like there's a physical pedagogy in place to become more and more skillful in biologically relevant domains. And I think as a bedrock for a psychological practice, maybe not a psychology, but a psychological practice, it's so solid. It's something that we're kind of getting a sense of in psychology in general. You have like the body keeps the score and these things, but I don't know that they go far enough in developing skill.
Yeah. That's my sense, is that, our philosophers are not warriors, and our warriors are not philosophers, right? But that there's a perspectival knowledge that is only gained through deep pursuit of physical skill, and that it's desperately needed in trying to understand this question, right? In trying to understand the meta crisis, I suppose. People have no relevant physical experience of something that could donate to understanding what they're trying to understand. And they can fantabulize just the most absurd worldviews because it's never been empirically tested by them in a physical way.
I don't know if this is too specific an example, but it comes up quite often in psychotherapy patients at this point. People have all sorts of trippy ideas about anger, for instance, anger being, the most widely repressed affect. But if I suggest for a person that there's some value in anger, immediately not having the concrete experience of anger, they imagine the person just like flying off the handle, acting out, smashing shit. It's like, that's one possible option for what you could do if you were angered. But there's a whole range of possible experiences too that you wouldn't even be able to conceptualize until you'd actually develop the means within yourself to regulate that sort of anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What that brings up for me is like the rough and tumble play that we do, right? And how people have incredible anxiety about touch, right? About how easily damaged they could be, about the potential for sexual energies to enter the equation, and they just need good games and a good play culture to enter into. And there's so much awareness of interpersonal dynamics that's just emergent in the individual through touch, including like, you're going to experience fear, you're going to experience anger, you're going to experience frustration in doing competitive things with people. If you wrestle, like, you're going to get smacked in the nose or the eye or something that's going to hurt for a second, and then you're going to, potentially you'll feel anxiety and fear and want to retreat from the situation. You might have to fight through that, or potentially you're going to want to ramp your energy up, and now you want to make sure that they get a little bit of what you got. And learning to regulate that is just extraordinarily valuable. And like, I always felt like, especially in my 20s, I had a lot of energy to want to fight. I loved to intellectually debate people and just try to smash them with ideas. And I was always thinking about getting in fights, and I was working as a bouncer and getting in fights. And when I wasn't getting in fights, I was very upset about it. And fantasizing about potential fights I could get in. But when I went to spar and I had a good spar, I'd go, do something and someone would be irritating, and it would just feel like the volume was turned down on the irritatingness. It was like, my aggression was well regulated. It was harmonized within me through the process of that wrestling. Dave, I see you smiling. Are there any thoughts percolating that you want to share with us? Any gnomic prognostications?
Well, I'm all for gymnasium and symposium, so there's that. Yeah, I agree with a lot of the need to embody, but then again, that's a tricky thing. There's lots of different types. For me, there's lots of different realms of types too. So if you look at learning 3 and how Bateson describes it, that could describe, for me, the entry into the last stage of exit of disenchantment, what I call the red work, or it could describe a realm break from that into the triangular realm of reenchantment in my terminology, or a liberation event. And they are completely different things, and they would all classify in that definition of learning 3. So it's not a particularly good definition. It just describes someone who's having a slightly abnormal thing, but they can be good, bad, or ugly, or they can be in different bits of the body or other aspects of the consciousness. And everyone thinks, again, that it's here or there or everywhere, but there's no kind of plot to that, so to speak. There's also kind of this kind of theme that embodiment is good, as I've met lots of very negative examples of people being quite embodied. They have very good skills, but they're using them in a very strange way. It's this kind of somato-sophistry. Just because you can make the skills and give it doesn't mean it's going to go and do something good. It's not a neutral thing like that.
Again, that comes back to the definition of the good, but that's also how I feel about the mindfulness aspect, right? And I don't think you necessarily disagree with this, but like you're pointing out that you can't, in some sense, speak very coherently about an awakening experience if you haven't had an awakening experience, right? Or if you haven't had this sort of movement out of this specific experience of disenchantment, which is all well and good. Like, I don't claim to know thing. I don't. If I haven't experienced it, I don't know it. But I can also see that there's often these very exaggerated claims about what these things offer, and then when I look at them, they don't seem to offer the things that really matter to me, right? So the big problem that I've had with spirituality is spiritual teachers don't seem to be very ethical people. And I care a lot more about people's ethics than I care about their awakening experiences. And so it's like, yeah, okay. I mean, I've had some, I would say, minor oneness experiences. I've had moments where I'm like practicing really intensely in the trees, and there's this kind of blurring of the sense of self with the tree. It's sort of as if it's co-participating in what's happening. And I kind of get this sense of, Viveki led us through a meditation at Return to the Source last year, where I was listening to the wind and the water, and I lost the perception that the wind and the water were external to me, right? There was a sort of a synesthesia of my breath and the wind as all sort of one continuous thing. It was really cool experience. I liked it. But I'm, I've never walked around in a state like that for an extended period of time. But I have known people who've claimed that, who are, are total narcissists. And that's something I can say that I have not been. I've noticed those tendencies within myself, and I've worked on them. But yeah, so I'm, that's where like the good that you're aimed at becomes really, really important to me, and say, okay, we're mapping these things. You're saying learning 3. So in that kind of system, like Viveki talks about this idea that there is sort of, like, you can have knowledge, you can have information. I know X, Y, and Z. And then you can have rationality, which is sort of the system by which you recognize what is relevant. right? And then you have wisdom, which is this sort of the what's the term it uses? I can't remember it, unfortunately, but it's the next level up. It's the meta cognition about your rationalities, the capacity to recognize how to step out of specific approaches to rationality, right? Or specific paradigms. It's how do you do that so that you're not trapped within the paradigms and perspectives that you use. I hope that's a fair way of describing how he looks at wisdom, which to me does kind of map to these levels of learning that you're talking about, right? So you can just gain a skill or gain information, like something like learning one. You can then begin to systematize and cultivate something with, that is coherent, right? You can recognize what's relevant within that. Once you're in the mode of being of mathematics, right? You can recognize, okay, this is the type of transformations that I need to do. And then you can say, oh, the mode of being of mathematics is no longer the relevant mode. So classic example I would give is, you're in a relationship, there's a conflict, and you can look at it as like a structural mechanical problem, or you can look at it as a emotional dynamic problem. And knowing when to shift levels is an important aspect of wisdom. Mm-hmm. So that's the way that I'm sort of looking at the learning three. And when you're talking about it, Dave, this idea of, okay, you can go meta and escape this aspect of a worldview, or you can go meta and do something else. That all makes sense to me, because it's like, yeah, I can have physical practice, and it's achieving this, or it's aimed at this. And this other physical practice is achieving something very different. But they're all physical practices. They're all examples of this one genus, right? There may be multiple species within that genus that we need to better articulate and recognize. But recognizing that they're within the same genus, if they are, is still useful information. So it seems to me, David, tell me if I'm mistaking you, that what you're interested in is a better map of what those transformations are, and how the process by which you get there can either result in a developmental pathway that continues to open up, right? What Rafe would call a reciprocal opening, versus ones that actually create breakdowns, right? You reciprocally open to a point, it collapses, and then you end up somewhere that's maybe not even as good as if you hadn't done that work. It's like, it's opening up, you're getting transformation, it's great. And then you did it wrong, it coagulates, and now you've got poison instead of the Sorcerer's Stone. Is that a useful way of thinking about what you're trying to do?
I am looking for a map. I have found a map. It's also different than what you're describing, mm-hmm. though it is inclusive of that. It just turns that on its side a bit and adds in some other things.
So let's I would ask you to expand, but I think you would tell me that you're not going to.
How would I expand on that? It's a thing. Trying to stick a triangular map through a square hole doesn't work so well. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the Reenchantment is a paradigm, but it's not a paradigm in the same way that everything else that's come before it is a paradigm. It's kind of, you just use that word as a placeholder. But included in looking backwards into the square is a look at all paradigms before it and how people don't escape those paradigms, how they shift those paradigms, how they can't get out of those paradigms. When they explain history, which bits they omit, which bits they have specific type of resistance to, which bits they have disenchantment triggers to, not triggers related to any trauma in their timeline, but ones related to the mind shape of the disenchantment itself, which are very different and manifest differently in the body and are observable after the fact. So subliminal whilst you're in it, but visible after.
Yeah, I think it's useful to leave some mystery there.
I think so.
I wanted to definitely dig specifically into Berman, and I think it'd be easy to kind of go down the road of, oh, what are the mind shapes and what is this that you're referring to? And I think people can look back at our first conversation or dig into your work in other ways. But let's talk. I wanted to talk about. I was curious. One of the sections that really stood out for me was a section around schizophrenia and the Batesonian holism approach to it versus the traditional approach. And I thought it was very intriguing, right? It offers a compelling hypothesis, but it seems like it's also simply something that could actually be answered through scientific epistemology, right? Like you just have to do research to see if the predictions of Batesonian holism actually work when applied to try to achieve the result of a return to, I guess, good dynamics and harmony, right? So that was written in 1981, I believe. And I haven't heard about Batesonian holism as an approach to schizophrenia treatment. It doesn't seem like we've made any progress really on schizophrenia treatment in that time period. And I'm just curious, I mean, Chandler, this is kind of close to your field. Like, okay, this is if Batesonian holism is a sort of like paradigm that is the metaphysics of the future. Here's a test case. Does it work?
I'll answer and try to suspend my love of Bateson, because that's a definite bias of mine, is that I'm a Bateson fanboy, but not a perfect epistemology by any stretch. It is striking to me that so few therapists recognize the name Bateson, and that when they have an association to it, it's only in relation to the double bind. So Bateson and his colleagues basically put together this ideological model of the double bind as essentially causative of schizophrenia. I don't know that I entirely buy that. I'm really interested in the critique put forth by Deleuze and Guattari of Bateson, in particular saying that double binds are way more common than we might think, and that they are more neuroticizing than schizophrenizing.
Can you just briefly review what a double bind is so people can follow the conversation?
Yeah. So a double bind is a situation that you cannot escape from. And it has a confusion of messages. There's a message and a kind of meta message that says something like, I'm beating the shit out of you because I love you so much. Can't you see how much I love you? The harder I hit, it's the more I love you. So there's this incongruence in a way between what's said and what is sort of communicated about what is said. And Bateson and his colleagues are basically putting forth the idea that that's psychologically untenable. Other examples might be, if I say to you right now, Rafe, be spontaneous, you lose no matter what. I can find some fault in that. That would be kind of what a double bind is, high level view, I'd say. Regarding testing the Batesonian thing, I think part of the challenge is that for the individual who's organized psychotically, where we might say, they have a DSM diagnosis of schizophrenia, society doesn't work for them. And so we could have a kind of test and a theory based on Bateson's epistemology. But as soon as that person leaves the clinic, they're going to encounter all sorts of epistemological problems just based on the way that the world itself is structured. They're going to continue to butt into things. And I would imagine based on how things go for a person once they leave an inpatient facility, it's not going to be a long time before they re-schizophrenize, we might say, or they display more and more of these characteristics. we've really done wrong by people that are psychotically organized, I think. And I don't know that that's solely an issue of the treatments available. I do think there is something about the, I don't know, call it the underlying premises of culture that don't go well for those individuals.
So what do you think of the hypothesis that schizophrenia is in some sense a modern ailment, that the tendency towards schizophrenia, or that the underlying attribute which ends up as schizophrenia within our culture has a niche within a traditional culture that allows it to be harmonized with the society, and that niche no longer exists, which is why it is pathological within our situation?
I think there's some credence to that. Yeah. There's a line that Berman cites. I can't remember the author, but they talk about the schizophrenic as the failed magician.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, there's something really poignant about that when I consider it. I mentioned Deleuze and Guattari earlier, and they talk about the schizophrenic as the one who tries to hit the wall of society but is blunted by it.
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't make it through to the other side. They talk about, for instance, this model of the schizo, different from the schizophrenic, different from schizoid, but that's the one who's made it through, who's kind of deterritorialized their being. I think there's something very exciting about that. I think it maybe is related to enchantment in a way, but I would imagine Dave maybe has some different thoughts.
Do you have any thoughts, Dave, on the relationship between what we've been talking about and disenchantment and reenchantment?
Not really schizophrenia, seeing as I'm not a clinician, but there's definitely the order of shock. Seeing what I call reenchantment could make someone have different types of breakdown, for sure. It's big, much bigger than people want to look at. And I think that, like, it's the quote, like, the kind of magician and the madman swim in the same water, but one drowns and one doesn't type of thing is apt. But I don't want to talk about psychological implications because I'm not a psychologist.
That's fair.
But think about it. Like, if you see the world turned completely upside down, it would be a big shock.
Yeah. There's one of the passages in Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, that really stuck with me and I think about a lot is the passage on the shamanic journey and how it relates to, it's, I think the chapter is something like the species of anomaly. And it talks about how there's the strange event, the stranger, and the revolutionary hero. And they all, in some sense, they all destabilize. And so they all are reacted to by society at large, at first as just like predator detection, right? There's just an alarm that says, okay, something has happened and it might mean catastrophe. Someone has arrived and maybe they bring disease, or maybe they destabilize the networks of society, right? Destabilize relationships, destabilize mores, right? And then someone within society sees the world differently. And that is potentially threatening to the way the world currently is. So the revolutionary hero is always sort of, when the heroism is effective, in some sense, they're prophetic. They recognize that there's a problem that the current system can't solve. So in order to solve the system, you have to be able to step outside of it, and you have to be able to reconceptualize it and then come back. And so you can look at any number of genius figures in history and see that they had a period of basically psychosis, and that this is ritualized in many tribal cultures as the shamanic journey, right? That you intentionally sort of strip out the structure such that you can have a novel solution to the problem that's generated. Right? This is kind of like a frame problem solution in the Vervaeke 9-dot kind of perspective, but that this is not the problem with it isn't just that you have to do that, but that it's inherently also threatening to the current structures of society. And that tension between the necessity of some kind of change and the destabilization associated with the agents of that change is going to be personally very stressful to anyone who's in the position of recognizing and seeing that something needs to change. That's certainly something that I feel like you see a lot of that in the communities that I grew up in, right? Like people were sensitive to something about the mainstream of America in the 1960s that just was untenable. And so they stepped outside of it. But how they integrated and came back was often pretty broken. So it's easy for me to see how there's the madman and magician swim in the same waters, right? Or the prophet and the madman. But I think it's a really powerful thing. And I think it does seem to map to the type of transformations that I see you trying to think about and affect in your work, Dave. Like, how do you recognize the species that you're aimed at in my language?
I think in some ways, if you look at the 1960s America, and in general, almost, it's like an attempt to heal a society that doesn't have the figure of the shaman, really. It has other things, for sure, and they're beneficial, and lots of things, but it doesn't really have that. And any attempt to do that without tradition or knowledge about how to do that can go catastrophically wrong.
I mean, yes. Sorry, I'm just like.
But the insight can still be sincere, and I would say that not every spiritual person I've met fits your description, Rafe, but a lot do. So, for sure. But then I have met some exceptional people, and they are actually the outliers that I model. And I still I love the idea of the roughhousing and the gymnasium and all of that stuff, because that's where I came out of, and I still train like that. And I will keep training like that because I think it has very positive effects if you do want to kind of look into the structure of reality slightly differently. If you hang out with kind of normal people as well and really quite strongly work the physical body, as well as if you're doing lighter stuff. I like all of them. I like quite strong training still. Very fun. And I like quite introspective training. It's also very fun. And both are useful in doing a third type of thing. And they're all kind of in what I do. And I want to keep them there and have them talk to each other.
I think that last part in particular really sticks with me in terms of how do we get these different practices talking with each other. I think if there's anything that the Batesonian epistemology suggests, it's like that question about the relatedness of these things and what can be learned from the similarities between them, the differences, the manner of practice. That, I think, is such a rich thing to explore. I'd be curious, Dave, and maybe it's not something that can be condensed, but in terms of maintaining the introspective practice, maintaining I call it a vigorous physical practice, how do you start to explore then the way that they talk to each other?
Well, I tend to, with my introspective practice, just set it up and practice, and I don't tend to talk about it with anyone. And my strength training and martial arts practice, I keep. So I do them not every day, but sometimes, and I like them as a communal effort. I like doing them with other people. It's like very, very cool stuff. And there's other body awareness practices and a few other different types of things I mix there. And I've got a certain scheduling that works with them. But for me, again, it kind of always comes back to what I'm talking about is when you start dissolving the aspects of the disenchantment affecting the organism, all types of triangulation naturally happen. But you have to kind of have a decent physical awareness and a decent X type of skills related to spiritual traditions and a decent X things related to body work and stretching. And so if you actually get those, and these are qualities you develop over years, and then they exist in the physical alembic itself, you don't really have to in fact, it doesn't make sense to think about protocols or procedures or that type of stuff. They just start talking. And then if you interface that with you relating to others in certain circumstances, both physical training in real life and the world, they start to communicate back and forth and you can decipher things out. So I can meet people who have different skill sets than me and I can tell they've got something happening in their body, but I don't know what it is. Or I can meet people who have the same and we go, it's this one. Let's get some training. And it's a fantastic thing out there. There is still this element of mystery. I meet interesting people who have all different types of realms, abilities communicating. And for me, that's the coolest stuff there is. How does this stuff work together? Of course, there's different traditions still kind of extant in the world that do it in systemic ways in their own paradigms. And they can be very auspicious for people to do. And there's all other types of things, some more intuitive, some more systemic. But the triangulation, it really does need a very solid. So I have a particular triangulation in my work, which is you need a very strong physical practice, both of harder stuff and all the whole spectrum through to lighter stuff. And then you need a praxis of more meditational and contemplative stuff that is working. And then you need a reenchantment provocation. You need to actually start working on that particular structure within the organism. And if you do that, you will get results that are different. And then when they pop up, if they pop up in the person, I can talk to that person about them. And that's the essence of teaching, right? Once the abilities come there, it's like teaching any type of just physical skill. Once the person gets these things, you can talk to them about it. But if they can't feel anything in their body, you have to use kind of different cueing, different this, until it evokes within them an actual experience of that then they can stabilize. So you get a flicker of it and a flicker again. I think it was there, and then it starts to think, and then they can train it, and then it over time, and these things quite often take time, the body has this ability now as a default. And it's like that, but it happens on multiple levels simultaneously.
Dave, do you think that Morris Berman had achieved reenchantment in his own life and himself as he wrote that book?
Not going to answer that question.
Specifically, I asked that because of the last chapter of the book, which I found quite disappointing after the rest of the book, because it's sort of just read as he was essentially doing a rearguard action against the potential conservative interpretation of Bateson's work and stating more or less from bald assertion that somehow the solution to all of this would end up looking like a fairly generic left-wing version of utopia that someone from the 1970s would have recognized, right? So, capitalism will be over, sexual mores will be loosened, everybody will be happy, we'll have lots of community gardens, will stop being bad for the environment. And that just seemed hopelessly naive to me. I was like, I don't know, this doesn't seem to even be connected to this. And I see that I've been struggling with some of those questions a lot recently of like, okay, we're proposing that the big systematic solutions in some sense have to be, they can't be solved without the cultivation of virtue at the individual and community level. But how does that actually scale up? It's a real question for me around community, right? How do we do community again? Or how do we do community well within the constraints of the world that we live in? Because there was lots of intentional communities. There was lots of organically developed, weird, just the community happened. I mean, like where I grew up, we always kind of joked that it was hippie community, but it wasn't really, because my dad just owned land and built houses on it and rented them. And the people who wanted to rent them were hippies. And then they did hippie things together on the land, right? Which was wonderful and terrible, right? But it left me like very, very skeptical of any sort of community process.
I can see that.
Now I'm in a space where all the like Bay Area rationalists who take an interest in my work and all these people are like, we're just gonna, buy a plot of land in Tennessee and create an intentional community, and we're all going to farm and we're all going to be polyamorous and it's going to be great. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's going to fail. It's going to turn into FTX, right? But I just went to visit a couple of friends this weekend, and I was talking to them about what's going on in their life, and they have young kids. And my sense is that like people are really, really struggling for community. It's what they really deeply need. And like I see it. So my kids now are 10 and 8 and 5, and we're kind of moving past the first difficult phase of childhood and potentially into the second difficult phase of childhood. But like the real need for like someone to just hold your baby so that you can take a nap is over. And my wife is so motivated to help other young mothers. She's just like, when I had young kids and you're an entrepreneur and I'm working full time, nobody, there had one person, she had one person who she could rely on to help out with her kids. Right. And so she's like, I'll help with you with your babies. Right. Like that's like, she wants to be the allo parent for all these kids. She likes kids, but it's more like she deeply empathizes with mothers. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that drives her. And we recently moved into a little cul-de-sac next to a park. And for the first time in our life, like there are just kids outside on the street playing. So, I have, obviously I want my kids to be outside playing as much as possible. And I grew up at the end of a dirt road with other kids and very few material possessions because we were poor, which meant that there was nothing keeping me inside. It wasn't even warm inside. So I might as well go outside and play in the woods with other kids in the neighborhood, right? And so as my own kids have developed, it's like, okay, they can do parkour and they're strong and they do martial arts and they're capable, but like they will just stay inside all day. And I have to like actively push them outside. So now we move into this cul-de-sac, and for my younger two kids, there are now friends who are available outside. And so they get home from school and they just want to go outside and play, and they will play until they have to come in. And it has everything to do with the proximity to other children and the fact that we live in a place where it's safe enough for them to be on the street. But at the same time, like, we don't know the other parents that well. And it's like scary to want to know the other parents because maybe you disagree with them about politics, right? Like, we'll understand all the weird perspectives that I have, right? And then we have these friends who we've known forever and who have great relationships. And it's like, we should, everyone jokes, we should all move together onto some farm. And I'm like, man, that sounds like a problem. But how do you do that?
Mm.
And so there's this, it feels like there's this naive utopianism that it, you know, somehow we still, like the polyamory thing to me is like, it's still trying to do the 1960s thing. It's like, we can all just, you know, let go of sexual jealousy, and then it'll bind the community together, and then everybody will get along really well. It's like, that's definitely not what I've seen in life at all. And all that I think also connects to like, how do we reconnect to the land well? Because I think fundamentally people need a better connection to that aspects of the self, to the aspects of self and the relationship to the natural world and to the community. And somehow the current capitalist system, or the disenchanted world, whatever it is, has made it really hard for us to get those connections well attuned. But I think a lot of times people think the past was like great. It was like, oh, we're just going to go back to the medieval village. Like, it's not what you think it was. Right? Like, you need community, but at the same time, communities can be so punishing to people. So I don't know. I guess I'm just throwing my thoughts at you guys and seeing what you pick up. It's not exactly a question, but for me, that was like really where the book fell down. I don't think that the answer is the liberal utopia or the progressive utopia. And I don't think the answer is the medieval village, right? Or the 1950s housewife, whatever golden era of the past your particular brand of conservatism wants to, or reactionariness wants to idealize. It's like there's a necessity to transcend and include, to kind of come to some solutions right now. And it feels like a lot of people have pointed out the problems, but very few people have thought deeply about the solutions. So that's where my head is at about this stuff. It's like, okay, great, but how does it actualize into a community that's actually reconnected with the land, actually reconnected with practices, and actually connected well with each other, that avoids the guru thing, that avoids the intense over policing of community, and that avoids the trap of like bad sexual ethics, because that I've seen mess up communities like more than anything else, just because of where I came from. And a lot of these prophets of reenchantment, they don't seem to recognize how big of a trap that is, how fast that can wreck everything they're trying to advocate for. So I apologize for not being able to formulate that into a question, but I'm curious for your reflections on the giant rant that I just went on.
I think it's an interesting life practice, I don't know, to try and figure out how to bridge from a kind of capitalist economic value system into something like an ethico-aesthetic paradigm. I think Berman does a decent job making a case for ethico-aesthetics as a possible organizing. But I think you're right that it's not like he gives a clear-cut plan aside from the liberal utopia. Maybe that just circles us back to the question of what the hell is the good, and then what's the beautiful, and then how do we organize in accordance with that? But I find myself thinking at least one of the organizing ideas has to be a kind of ecological attitude that is, if the environment dies, we die. It's like all other hierarchies aside, we know that that one's pretty reliable. Organism without environment doesn't last. So I think a kind of that skews a little too easily into like a green politics, but like, there's got to be some awareness of finite resources.
Yeah, I find that one so hard because like a lot of people in this space are really devoted to what I think of as a kind of environmental alarmism that I think is actively harmful for people and often anti-human. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, this is a whole nother topic, and I don't feel super confident in it, but I would just say that I'm relatively skeptical that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. I think it's happening, and I think that that human beings play a role in it. But I don't think it's an existential threat to humanity. And there's part of me that thinks it's a bit of a shell game, because I think that species loss is a huge, huge problem that somehow we're not actually paying that much attention to. I think ecosystem loss is a huge problem that somehow we're not paying that much attention to. I think environmental pollutants destroying our biology and the biology of all these systems is a huge problem that we're not paying that much attention to. And I think a lot of that comes down to actually getting people to be involved stewards of the land because they have real experience of it. And there's this weird way in which the climate perspective on the environment somehow plays out as we all have to live in hives and cities, right?
Mhm.
This is obviously like a topic that could be an entire podcast, and I'll probably get lots of people pissed off at me because of what I've said. But it's one of these places where I think that like that binary of politics that we talked about is deeply misleading. We have to believe this thing because it's what the right thinking people believe. And then the people who push back on it just end up blind to a set of problems that are really bad. It's like I don't know. Sorry, I had to say that because it's just like, I mean, there's a raft of plastic the size of Texas floating in the ocean.
Yeah, but I own a chunk of it, so I'm just going to set up shop there.
That's
good.
Okay. I don't know. Keep going. Sorry. Green politics.
Keep going with what? Yeah, I think with so much of it, it's like, well, we don't know the second order consequences of some of these things. And so to make policy decisions and certainly decisions at a local level that are somehow supposed to address global problems, like that's just doomed to fail. But I think what you mentioned is so spot on, like at a community level, at least, if people can develop a real connection to the places they dwell and cultivate a kind of stewardship, not out of like guilt and moral obligation, but out of a sense of like, we've got this little creek that comes down behind the cabin, and I like going and sitting by the creek. And if there's shit that floats down there, like that impinges upon my enjoyment. And so I'm going to clean up that stuff, not because, whomever is shaking their finger at me, but because I like a beautiful place.
I think fundamentally we need people to fall in love with the world, with the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that someone who truly loves the land isn't going to just leave their trash all over it. And that's why I think like the practices that we offer are so profound. And that I do think that I think we need bottom up and top down solutions, but that it's very easy to sort of like reach for these top down solutions. And without a good sense of what's happening at the bottom up level, you just end up with something that's very tyrannical and that often has negative consequences that you didn't anticipate. So I do think that like a lot of times the thing that's going to scale up is just like, it happens in your neighborhood, right? It happens in relationship to your local farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was thinking about this. I was walking through, thinking about how towns have characters. When I was walking through Bellingham here, and I really love Bellingham, and it's a great town in a lot of ways, and also has its like tyrannies, right? Like the policies around the wetlands here are really, 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 really strict. And I know a number of people who just had the most absurd things happen to them because of these policies around wetlands. But then I was walking through the city and just randomly, like not aware that I was going to do it, I came across a pond, like a pretty big pond with lilies and fallen snags and lots of bird life on it. And I was like, that pond exists because this is the type of town where people can become terroristic about protecting the stormwater thing, right? It's like there's some, like, obviously there's a better balance of that, but like the character of the town is set in some sense because people do care, right? I was walking this morning through Welcome Falls Park, and there were 2 deer wading through the water, and I got to just watch the deer. There's deer everywhere in Bellingham, and it's like there is something that's different about this town compared to some other town, because there is a green ethic that has been important to many of the people who've lived here for a really long time. Dave, did you have any responses to my rant?
Yes. You touched on a lot of like interesting and quite a lot of correct and unsightly aspects of many things, individual, community, and ecological. Yeah, I think the title you made it was Reenchanting the Earth, and the whole like the connection there is, I don't have to tell you guys about it, but I love going out into the forest. I like the city I'm in, Canberra, has a lot of wilderness just inside the city, and floating trash things and all that. It's just, I don't know. I don't try not to politicize it, but I feel very strongly about protecting the planet and its ecosystems for our enjoyment and continued existence. And fun. It's fun going out in the bush. There's, in terms of the group aspect, I don't know. It's interesting. Surely we've formed auspicious groups in the past where we can actually communicate and get along, but we have trouble doing that for certain periods of time at the moment. My focus, I guess, is largely individual and with individuals, and trying to have some different new form of group arise, which I do believe is possible. I'm quite optimistic about that, but in a kind of like enchanted realist way, in terms of I agree with a lot of the negative things that you mentioned, and they are real problems that do exist in the real world, and they are complicated. So yeah, like this year I've been fighting my reasonably savage hermiting tendencies and going out more into different communities, which has been nice. So I'll just keep doing that, I guess. In terms of the last bit of the book, again, I won't say too much, but Reenchantment itself is a parallax. So what people say about Reenchantment is itself showing the things that I'm doing. Same with alchemy, same with some of the figures related to this, Reich and Jung and all those. What people do with their work is itself indicative of what I am doing in a very, I think, intriguing way, which I hope to present sometime in this lifetime, hopefully this year, so that we can talk about it whilst it's all out. But yeah, I'm quite hopeful about there's a possibility of, I don't know, like some sort of neo-guild structure where people have their particular crafts and they teach people and have apprentices, let's say, and then they have other people that they do work on. And then, let's say, journeymen and masters get together and have a meeting and can actually have a reasonably civil discussion and probably do some sort of practice around it as well. I think that's possible. And what can come out of that, who knows, but could be very interesting.
That I find very exciting.
Yeah, I've been involved in a project called the Respond Project, which is organized around John Vervaeke's work, and it's about essentially trying to create a network of wisdom practitioners. And the idea of the guild structure has been a major touch point of thinking as well. So it's kind of interesting to see you bring that up. Need to dig back into my history. The rise of capitalism and its conflict with the guilds. I'm not sure that guilds are the best structure, but I think there is a necessity for a communal aspect to the cultivation of practices. You know, one thing I've heard people say a lot is there is no parkour community. There is no X community. There is no this community. And I think that really comes from this sort of atomized Cartesian thing. It's like, really, there's nothing above the level of the individual agent, right? And so, you know, it's weirdly almost objectivism, right? It's like Ayn Randian, but like, obviously there are communities, right? We are constantly networked into sort of cultures that are passing information back and forth that we are impacted by. Like, we think that like you're not what you think isn't yours, right? Like, it's your individual genius interacting with some innumerable number of influences, and all of that is moving through these communities. You could even think of it as a spirit, right? Like, when you become a parkour teacher, you're entering into relationship with the spirit of parkour, which is moving in its own directions and doing its own things, and kind of maybe chaotic relative to you in a way, but it's out there. Like, it's not like, you know, like, I discovered this, like, I could have my own definition of parkour and I could do this, but like, my students came in with their ideas based on what they saw on YouTube. So it was like there were things happening in the community that were always impacting me and my students. So it does seem like, in some sense, the capitalist paradigm or the corporate paradigm, it doesn't give us a good way to seek virtue in the community aspect. If you don't have a really good way of describing what a community is or what a collective intelligence is, then you can't ask how we can do it better. What are the dynamics that make it work? So I think, in some sense, that idea of the Neo Guild, and I certainly think, like, we need a real apprenticeship model, right? Like, the fact that people run certifications for 2 days is the most absurd thing, right? It's the most obviously capitalistically just illusory, right? Like, I will give you a piece of paper. Like, everything about it is just bullshit, right? It's just 100% bullshit, right? Like, you can learn how to be a coach in a weekend. Bullshit. I will give you this paper which will make you more officially a coach than you would have been in. Bullshit. That piece of paper will actually help you sell yourself on the market. Mostly bullshit. And yet it's giant, right? Like, every marketing consultant that I talk to virtually is like, you're being an idiot for not offering that. Sorry. And of course my camera died.
Well, we've had long conversations about how idiotic most marketers.
Time to go, but my face is still yeah. There we go. I'm happy with that. Everything's bullshit. We have to re-enchant ourselves so we can escape the bullshit. Any final words?
I'm good. We can talk again next time.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied. Yeah. I think there's more to cover, but a good first go of it.
For folks who are interested in Dave's work, physicalalchemy.com, Physical Alchemy on Facebook. Those are the places.
Yeah. Instagram as well now, kind of.
Oh, Instagram. That's new. You're catching up. In 10 years, you'll be on TikTok. Chandler, Ecosomatics, that's coming back now?
ChandlerStevens.com is the best hub for the time being, doing a couple of updates on the various websites, a couple too many projects to juggle, but ChandlerStevens.com is a fine place.
Find you. Okay. Thank you guys, and it was a pleasure.